Welcome to the home of 100 to 1 Faith TV. I'm Larry Chant, and this is the message for Grace United Methodist Church on Sunday, August 9th, 2020. This is our 10th message in a sermon series on the book of Revelation. We're nearing the end of the book, so by now you know what's next. Go ahead and say it with me, church. God's gonna win.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me. Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home.
Last week we saw the fall of Rome, a regime so evil and sick in the head that John described it as a puppet of Satan. Friends of Satan may have power, they may have tools of cruelty, but they do not have any true friends. The day came when all of their friends turned on Rome, and the only mourning was at the cash register. But what happens next? To understand this next passage, you have to keep in mind John's Jewish background. First of all, the Jews have a strong belief in justice. God will not be mocked. The score will be settled. Second, the Jews believe that this will happen on this earth. Getting justice in the spiritual realm just isn't enough. They were looking for a physical resurrection and physical justice on this physical globe. So for all those who had suffered unfairly, God had to make it up for them on earth. But you see, earth, no matter how glorified, no matter how improved it might be, well, earth will never be eternally perfect. God could set things right for a while, but eventually the wheels would fall off again. And remember how many times we've seen that through history. Well, you know that John sees history as a series of cycles. And as long as we're on this earth, there are going to be cycles of God's peace and Satan's schemes. So that's what we're working with here in this passage. Physical justice on this earth, a reward for those who have suffered, and history will repeat itself. Keep those things in your pocket as we dive into Revelation 20. Last week, as we studied chapter 19, we saw the serpent's earthly representatives thrown down to hell. This week we read how Satan himself is finally bound and thrown down, but he's not bound eternally, only for 1,000 years. Why? Well, that's right, because history always repeats itself on this earth, and nothing in this world lasts forever. Look at verse 4. I saw the thrones. Remember, we've seen those thrones before. There are 24 of them encircling the Lamb, and they belong to the elders of the Old and New Testament church. In this dark time, Rome was judging the people of God. Now we see God has restored justice, and the people of God are judging the earth. In verse 5, the judges hand down decisions of justice, and that vision of justice continues. Those who have suffered the worst kind of death now enjoy the greatest reward. Verse 7, all earthly things come to pass, even the 1,000-year reign. And here we see a new chapter of the same old story. Satan is up to his old tricks again and trying to start the same old fight. The strange names we see here, Gog and Magog, are borrowed from the prophet Ezekiel. The land of Gog and their leader Magog are the enemies Ezekiel saw lining up to fight Israel. And in time, in Jewish literature, Gog and Magog came to stand for anybody who wanted to fight against God's people. In verse 10, the final sentence of Satan's hell is carried out, and this time God's judgment is eternal. But in order to make it eternal, we can't stay on this earth, can we? So we need a change of scenery. We need a heavenly place to celebrate eternal victory. In verse 11, we begin to see that eternal promise. The presence of Christ is too big, too powerful, too brilliant for anything else to stand. It overcomes everything else in its path. The Apostle Paul had the same vision of eternal life. He said, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And in the presence of Christ, everything else flees away. In biblical terms, we call that the power of glory. The light of Christ is too big, too strong for anything else remains. It goes all the way back to the book of Exodus, where Moses himself could not enter the Holy of Holies because the Shekinah glory was too powerful, too palpable, too brilliant for even him to enter. In verse 12, we come to the time of the final judgment day. Now that idea runs throughout the entire New Testament. Jesus talked about the day of judgment. The book of Hebrews says, it is appointed unto human beings once to die and then the judgment. Nobody likes to be judged, but for those who have suffered so much for Christ, the judgment is good news. The people who tormented the church will not escape their punishment. They have to face judgment. And those who suffered so long and so unfairly, well, they won't go without their reward. There will be eternal justice, and God will make it right. In verse 13, we see that even the sea is under God's control. Remember, the Romans used the sea as their highway to go to and fro and conquer various nations. In the minds of Old Testament believers, the sea was a dangerous, evil place. But even the sea is not out of God's reach, and the souls claimed by the sea are still in God's hand, and they too are called up for judgment. But at the end of all things, God's greatest judgment is upon death itself. This battle between grace and death was decided when Jesus called Lazarus to come out of the tomb. Death would no longer be the ultimate power once Jesus spoke, Lazarus, come out. And that war was won when Jesus himself rose from the dead and the angels announced, you come seeking Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen. Now in this passage, the final judgment has come, and death is not part of God's eternal plan. Now, that victory over death cannot take place in this physical world as we know it. In our universe, everything dies. Stars die, planets die, living things die, people die. As the ancient prayer says, in the midst of life, we are in death. From whom can we seek help? Yet, there is something deep within us that knows death is really not part of the plan. It's not something we know because of physical evidence around us. It's something we know in our souls. 3 years ago, I got an unexpected phone call telling me my brother had died of a sudden heart attack. And I shouted, "No," over and over. No, it couldn't be true. I knew it couldn't be true. My brother was just 57 years old. But folks of Native ancestry still have the shortest lifespan of all Americans. Both of my grandfathers died in their 50s, and all the evidence should have showed me that this was not only possible, but something I should even expect and accept. Some would say it's just one stage of grief, a stage we call denial. Psychologist Ernest Becker says, "What does it mean to be a self-conscious animal? The idea is ludicrous, if not monstrous. It means to know that one is food for worms. This is the terror, to have emerged from nothing, then to have a name, consciousness of self, deep inner feelings, an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression, and yet with all this, to die. It seems like a hoax, which is why one type of cultural man rebels openly against the whole idea of God. What kind of deity would create such a complex and fancy worm food? Well, Becker says our denial of death keeps us from facing the reality of life. But I'll tell you, my soul knows a deeper truth. The Apostle Paul quotes Hosea as he writes, of resurrection, overwhelming death for all eternity, when he says, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" Yes, death is a part of this world, but God has broken its teeth and extracted the venom. The fierce demon that wanted to swallow life has become a servant in the hands of God. In this world, death is a necessary part of the circle of life, but eternal life will swallow up that awful swallower. The great preacher and poet James Weldon Johnson rose up on the wings of sanctified imagination to give us a God's eye view of death, not as a mighty victor, but as a temporary servant on a leash. He said, "Weep not, weep not. She is not dead. She's resting in the bosom of Jesus. Heartbroken husband, weep no more. Grief-stricken son, weep no more. Left lonesome daughter, weep no more. She's only just gone home. Day before yesterday morning, God was looking down from his great high heaven, looking down on all his children, and his eye fell on Sister Caroline, tossing on her bed of pain. And God's big heart was touched with pity, with the everlasting pity. God sat back on his throne, and he commanded that tall, bright angel standing at his right hand, "Call me Death." And that tall, bright angel cried in a voice that broke like a clap of thunder, "Call Death! Call Death!" And the echo sounded down the streets of heaven till it reached way back to that shadowy place where death waits with his pale white horses. And Death heard the summons. He leapt on his fastest horse, pale as a sheet in the moonlight. Up the golden street Death galloped, and the hoofs of his horse struck fire from the gold, but they didn't make no sound. Up Death rode to the great white throne and waited for God's command. And God said, "Go down, Death. Go down to Savannah, Georgia, down in Yamacraw, and find Sister Caroline. She's borne the burden and heat of the day. She's labored long in my vineyard, and she's tired. She's weary. Go down, Death, and bring her to me." And Death didn't say a word, but he loosed the reins on his pale white horse, and he clamped the spurs to his bloodless sides, and out and down he rode through heaven's pearly gates, past suns and moons and stars. On Death rode, leaving the lightning's flash behind. Straight down he came. While we were watching round her bed, she turned her eyes and looked away. She saw what we couldn't see. She saw Old Death. She saw Old Death coming like a fallen star, but Death didn't frighten Sister Caroline. He looked to her like a welcome friend, and she whispered to us, "I'm coming home." And she smiled and closed her eyes, and Death took her up like a baby. And she lay in his icy arms, but she didn't feel no chill. And Death began to ride again, up beyond the evening stars, into the glittery light of glory, onto the great white throne, and there he laid Sister Caroline on the loving breast of Jesus. And Jesus took his own hand and wiped away her tears, and he smoothed the furrows from her face. And the angel sang a little song, and Jesus rocked her in his arms and kept a-saying, "Take your rest, take your rest. Weep not, weep not. She's not dead. She's resting in the bosom of Jesus." That's right, friends. Mighty Death has lost his sting. And today we all know what that means. It means God's gonna win.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I looked up the chair.